Imagine this scenario for a moment. You're thousands of feet up, cruising altitude, maybe looking out the window of a modern jetliner. Everything seems perfectly normal. Then, out of the blue, warnings start flashing. Systems that seem completely unrelated start glitching. An engine sputters, maybe another follows. And that critical backup power you just assume will kick in. It doesn't. Now, what if that wasn't just terrible luck, not random failures, but something, coordinated, something, using the plane's own advanced technology against it? Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're exploring exactly that, the really complex and maybe a bit unsettling world of cyber-physical risks in modern aviation. We'll be looking specifically at how the sophisticated digital systems in aircraft, like the Boeing 787 Dreamliner for instance, could, at least theoretically, be manipulated to cause this kind of cascading failure. To help us understand this, we're drawing from two really interesting sources today. One's called Interlinked Engine and APU Failure Scenarios, and the other is titled, Is It Possible to Spoof a Boeing 787? Exploring the cyber-physical risks in modern avionics.
Yeah, and our goal here really is to shed some light on how a very sophisticated, very targeted cyber attack could potentially work. We're talking about using something called sensor spoofing and exploiting the interconnectedness of all these systems on board, how that might lead from, say, an engine shutting down to maybe another one following, and even crucial backups failing to start. We want to show you why this isn't just, science fiction anymore. It's a really critical area that aviation safety needs to grapple with.
Okay, let's definitely unpack that term first. Spoofing. It sounds kind of like something from a spy movie, doesn't it? What does it actually mean in an aviation context?
It does have that ring to it, but yeah, the sources define it pretty clearly. In aviation cybersecurity, spoofing is essentially the deliberate sending of false sensor signals or fake data. The whole point is to mislead the aircraft's onboard systems, to trick them. And the practical effects, well, they could be significant. If you feed false information, you could potentially cause critical components to make the wrong decisions. We're talking flight management computers, the FADEC, that's the full authority digital engine control, even things like GPS or GNSS for navigation. Or imagine tricking the altitude sensors, the LRRA, the low-range radio altimeter, making the plane think it's much higher or lower than it actually is.
Wow. That's quite concerning. So why the focus on the Boeing 787 Dreamliner specifically in these discussions? What makes it such a key example for this kind of risk?
Well, the 787 is a good case study because it's really one of the most digitally advanced airliners out there. It's built around what's called the Common Core System, the CCS. Think of it as the plane's central computer network, using an Ethernet-based architecture, very different from older designs. Plus, you've got fly-by-wire controls computers interpreting the pilot's actions, the FADEC engine controls we mentioned, real-time data links to the ground via satellite, even automated switching for power and hydraulics. It's incredibly integrated. And that's the key point, really. All these amazing innovations, they boost performance, efficiency, sure, but they also create these incredibly complex interdependencies. And that means, theoretically, just one well-crafted, spoofed sensor input hitting the right spot at the right time could potentially trigger a whole chain reaction of failures.
So it's not really a weakness in the traditional sense, but more that its very sophistication, its interconnected nature, creates this potential vulnerability. You're tricking it, not breaking it.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. It's not about finding a bug in the code necessarily. It's about exploiting the system's inherent trust in its sensor data. The system does exactly what it's supposed to do based on the input it receives. If that input is fake, but looks real enough, well, the system follows its programming, potentially towards a dangerous outcome. It's following rules perfectly, just based on false premises.
Right, that distinction is crucial. It's not malfunctioning, it's being misled.
Okay.
So this is where it gets really, really interesting and maybe a bit scary. Our sources suggest that spoofing, done with enough sophistication, isn't just about confusing the plane, it could potentially lead to engine failures. Actual power loss. What specific parts are vulnerable here?
The sources point to a few key sensors that, if spoofed, could impact the engines. There's the total air temperature sensor, the TAT, the low-range radio altimeter, LRRA, also the sensors measuring engine speed, RPM, that's N1 and N2, and of course navigation systems like GPS or GNSS, which provide data used by various systems. Feeding false readings from these could potentially trick the FADEC, the engine controller, or other systems into taking inappropriate action, like shutting down an engine. And it's important to circle back to that point about system design. Safety-critical psychomerit, like the FADEC logic or the flight control laws, is built to incredibly high standards. DO-178C Level A is often mentioned. It's designed to be extremely robust against direct modification, against hacking in the traditional sense. But spoofing, It sidesteps that.
Ah, okay. It doesn't need to change the rules, just change the information the rules are applied to.
Precisely. The system follows its safety logic perfectly, but based on fabricated inputs that make it think there's a dangerous condition requiring shutdown. And what's really fascinating, and frankly quite concerning in these sources, is the exploration of how one engine failure might not be the end of the story, how it could cascade into a second engine failure. They lay out several potential scenarios for how this could happen, creating that double engine out situation, even if the root causes seem separate at first glance.
Okay, so losing one engine is bad enough, obviously, but losing both, that's a whole different level. You'd normally assume the other engine keeps going. How could one failure precipitate another? What are these interlinked scenarios?
Well, one possibility the sources raise is a shared fault in the FADEC logic or software. If both engines use the exact same FADEC software, which is common, then a vulnerability or a specific reaction to certain spoofed data, maybe false RPM or temperature readings, that triggers a shutdown in one engine. Well, if the same false data is fed to the other engine's FADEC, it could react the same way.
Right, a common mode failure triggered by the spoofed data affecting identical software. Makes sense. What else?
Another critical area is electrical or power bus failure. Modern aircraft have complex electrical systems. If one engine fails, its generator goes offline. The system is designed to automatically reconfigure the electrical buses, reroute power. But what if that bus switching logic fails? Maybe due to the initial failure, or maybe it's also targeted. If that happens, the FADEC controlling the other, still functioning engine might lose power. And without power, it shuts the engine down.
So a failure in the power management system itself could take out the second engine. Wow.
Then there's something perhaps more fundamental, a fuel contamination or supply issue. If both engines are drawing fuel from a common source, like a shared tank or line, and that fuel becomes contaminated, or maybe the fuel flow is somehow deliberately disrupted further upstream, then yeah, one engine failure could easily be followed by the other as it ingests the same bad fuel or loses supply.
Okay, that feels a bit more like a traditional failure mode, but still potentially linkable or exploitable in a sophisticated attack. What about things specific to the 787's architecture? You mentioned the CCS.
Right, the Common Core System malfunction. Because the CCS is so central on the 787, acting like the brain, a fault within the CCS itself, or perhaps malicious code introduced into it, could theoretically issue incorrect shutdown commands to both engines. This could be especially plausible if the CCS logic is designed to interpret certain, perhaps spoofed, sensor readings as indicating a catastrophic situation that necessitates shutting everything down as a fail-safe measure. A fail-safe triggered by false information.
A fail-safe action based on a lie, essentially.
Exactly. And finally, tying it directly back to spoofing. Simultaneous spoofed sensor inputs affecting both engines. Instead of just targeting one, an attacker could potentially feed coordinated false data, say fake air temperature or incorrect GPS altitude, to both engine control systems concurrently. Each FADC might then independently decide to shut down based on that false data, leading to a near simultaneous dual engine failure, even though they reacted individually.
Okay, that paints a pretty grim picture, dual engine failure, possibly triggered by these interconnected, potentially spoofed events. So engines out. The next thought for any pilot, for anyone, is the APU, the auxiliary power unit. That's your crucial backup power source, right? But the sources we're looking at suggest even that isn't a guaranteed save. How could the APU itself fail to start or provide power when it's needed most?
Yeah, that's another really critical finding in these analyses. The APU, while designed as a backup, has its own potential failure points in these scenarios. One way is through spoofed inputs or logic that blocks its start sequence. For instance, remember the GPS spoofing. If the aircraft is tricked into thinking it's still on the ground, well, there's often logic, APU inhibit logic, that prevents the APU from automatically starting while airborne under normal circumstances. That logic could be wrongly triggered. Or, more directly, malware within the system or a corrupted CCS could just block the APU start command or prevent the system from allocating the necessary power bus to even try starting it.
So the start button might not even work, electrically speaking.
Potentially. Which leads to the next point. Electrical bus mismanagement. Even if the start command is sent, the APU needs power to start itself. If those critical power buses, the sources mentioned P100 and P200 specifically, haven't been correctly reconfigured after the main engine generators went offline, then the circuitry needed to actually crank the APU might simply be unpowered. The source notes the APU start logic often connects via the P200 bus, highlighting that connection. Even without touching the P150 APU panel directly, a bus issue could stop it.
Okay, so the power grid itself could prevent the backup from starting. What else?
There's also incorrect mode sensing. The aircraft uses various pressure, altitude, air data sensors, weight on wheel sensors to know its current state, like in flight or on ground.
Oh.
If these sensors are spoofed or malfunctioning, the aircraft systems might get confused about what mode they're in. They might think they're in a state where starting the APU isn't allowed or appropriate, even though they're actually in desperate need of it.
It thinks it's on the ground when it's flying or some other invalid state.
Something like that. And finally, even if you overcome all that, even if the APU starts spinning, its generator might remain offline or unavailable. Just because the APU turbine is running doesn't guarantee it's producing usable electrical power. The electrical control logic governing the generator could be compromised, or the generator system itself could be damaged or disabled as part of a broader attack. So you get the noise, but not the juice.
So you could have the APU running, but still no power coming online.
It's a possibility outlined in these failure chains. And when you put all these pieces together, the dual engine failure, then the automatic deployment of the RAT, the ram air turbine, that little emergency propeller, followed by the APU failing to start or come online, leading potentially to total power loss. That sequence, that chain of events, aligns disturbingly well with what you might expect from a highly coordinated, sophisticated spoofing or cyber sabotage attack.
And the consequences of that total power loss scenario, they're profound. Losing fly-by-wire control because the computers don't have power, especially if key buses like P100, P200, or the P150 APU panel bus go dark, it's a chilling thought.
And you mentioned the source tentatively links this type of potential failure chain to real-world incidents being investigated, like AI-171, even though no conclusions are drawn. It just highlights that these aren't purely abstract academic exercises.
Absolutely. It grounds the discussion, which naturally leads to the question, who could even do something like this? What kind of actor would have the capability?
Yeah, that's a huge question, because this sounds incredibly complex. What do the sources say about the required capability level?
They're pretty explicit about it. Given the immense coordination needed, the deep, intricate knowledge of the aircraft systems, the potential need for access, the assessment is that this kind of operation likely falls into the realm of state-level actors, or perhaps very well-funded and sophisticated intelligence-backed groups, not your average hacker.
So, nation-state level resources, potentially. That seems to be the implication. The indicators listed really point that way. Things like needing potential access deep within the supply chain, maybe to compromise components before they're even installed, needing a very thorough understanding of aviation software standards like DO-178C, requiring sophisticated radio frequency spoofing capabilities, ground to air, and, importantly, the sources suggest the motive might be covert sabotage, not something like ransomware or a public attack. No obvious fingerprints left behind, just an unexplained catastrophic failure.
Silent disruption. Okay, so given these potential threats, even if they require very high-level actors, what's the path forward? What can be done to protect these advanced aircraft? What do sources recommend for aviation safety?
Thankfully, they don't just raise the alarm, they do propose countermeasures. A key one is enhancing sensor cross-validation logic, making systems smarter about comparing data from multiple different sensors to spot anomalies or inconsistencies that might indicate spoofing. Developing specific spoof detection algorithms for vulnerable inputs like GPS, the radio altimeter, LRA, and air temperature, TAT. Algorithms designed explicitly to look for the telltale signs of fake signals.
Building smarter digital immune systems, in a way.
Kind of, yeah. Also, hardening the systems themselves. Secure FADEC firmware that includes intrusion detection capabilities, making sure critical software update pathways are air-gapped and isolated, meaning updates aren't done over potentially insecure networks, but through controlled offline processes.
Physical security for digital updates.
Exactly. And on the human side, enhancing pilot training specifically for these nightmare scenarios, flying on R8 tower only, handling degraded fly-by-wire controls, making sure crews can react effectively if the automation is compromised.
So technical fixes, process changes, and human factors all play a part.
They have to. And the overall message, the big call to action from these sources is really fundamental. It's that aircraft like the 787 and others following suit are essentially complex flying data centers. Cyber-physical attacks aren't just theoretical anymore. They need to be treated as real potential safety threats, right alongside traditional concerns like engine reliability or structural integrity, Regulators, manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus, airlines, they all need to really embrace this. Treat spoofing and avionics manipulation as serious risks. Implement things like zero trust principles, don't automatically trust data, even internally. Build better ways to investigate anomalies that might be cyber-induced. It's about building true cyber resilience into aviation.
It really reframes the challenge, doesn't it? This deep dive has certainly highlighted how interconnected everything is on these modern machines and how that creates both incredible capability and potentially new kinds of vulnerability. We have to think beyond just mechanical failures now.
We absolutely do. And it leaves you with a pretty profound thought, I think. As our aircraft become ever more automated, more reliant on software and data, more connected, how do we ensure that technology continues to enhance safety? How do we prevent the very systems designed to protect us from becoming vectors for new, unprecedented risks? What does airworthiness truly mean in an age of invisible cyber threats? That's the ongoing challenge.